Hello and welcome to Water Underground Talks Season 2. I'm happy to introduce Crystal Ng from University of Minnesota. Season 2 is going to be focused on groundwater, anti-racism, decolonization, and sustainable development. And Crystal is a leader in integrating environmental justice into teaching. Unfortunately, we're not going to hear about that today, but what we're really going to highlight is her research in this domain. And I want to start with a question. Crystal, how did you first develop a passion for water?
Yeah, well, first off, thank you so much, Tom, for including me in this series. It covers such an important topic, so I'm glad that you're giving us an opportunity to share and have discussion around it. So I actually have to say that honestly, I don't think that I thought all that much about water when I was little. I grew up in the state of Maine, and I think I really took water for granted. Whenever I needed water, I turned on the tap and clean water came out. So I think the first time I really started thinking about it was in high school. I was an exchange student in Bolivia, and I was living in the city of Cochabamba, which is in the semi-arid part of the country. And it was the first time I ever experienced water stress. It was actually a drought year. The streams were running dry, and actually water issues clearly impacted people. Communities were actually striking and protesting throughout the year because there was an international company that was actually trying to come in and privatize their water. So it really became clear to me at that point that water is a precious resource and it should be a common human right. And so that experience in Bolivia strongly motivated me to want to study water because it was an opportunity to use my math and science skills to do something that can benefit people.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I actually remember those times from the news in Cochabamba, and I've taught about that problem. So that's cool to hear that inspired your early passions. And I guess those have really blossomed into both your research and your teaching. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about how you see the different themes of this season around groundwater, anti-racism, decolonization, and sustainable development, how these play out in your region or in your field of research and teaching.
Yeah, so in the research that I'll present about, I'm trying to understand groundwater, but actually I would say the overarching goal is really to support tribal sovereignty and tribal communities. Mm-hmm. We're trying to address past and ongoing harms on tribes by settler institutions and activities that I acknowledge that I'm part of. Mm-hmm. Native American tribes in the Upper Great Lakes region, which is where I live, they've had their water and culturally important practices threatened by environmental degradation. And they've had a long history of researchers like me ignoring their concerns and conducting unethical and exploitative research. And we're trying to change that with our work.
Wow, that's wonderful. I look forward to hearing more about it in the research talk. I want to ask a couple more personal questions. The first is how your personality or your personal interests strengthen you as a scientist.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of aspects. I'd say I'm very hardworking and dedicated, and it's really challenging to figure out answers to our science questions. I've heard it explained that we call it research because we often get it wrong at first and we have to search again. And I think it's really been helpful for me that I acknowledge that I might not be getting things right the first time, but I can pick myself back up and try it again. And I think the other part is I really try to be open-minded about new ideas. And I think this is so essential for us scientists because what we're trying to do is learn and discover new things. So we have to be ready to, really update how we think about things based on new information. And lately in my collaboration work that I'll be talking about, I'm realizing how valuable it is to be open-minded about who provides this new information.
Yeah, thank you. And is there one kind of nugget or one lesson that you most want to share with the next generation of groundwater scientists and practitioners that are hopefully listening to these talks?
Yeah, so I guess kind of playing off of my last answer, I think it's important to be open-minded about who holds knowledge about groundwater. It might not be, just the people and experts that we usually think about. And if you get to that point of gaining knowledge about groundwater yourself, remember that you are in a position to apply that knowledge to do something that can benefit society.
Wonderful, thanks. That's a great motivation. And one maybe final question is if you've had any personal experiences around these topics, especially around racism or sexism that has kind of shaped you and impacted you that you'd be interested in sharing?
Yeah, so this is a really big topic, and I think we usually feel like we can't raise it in professional
Mm-hmm.
settings. So,
Mm-hmm.
actually, thank you for giving us an opportunity to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I am a second generation Chinese American woman who is working in STEM. And I'd have to say, growing up in Maine, I've had experiences of being teased for, looking different than most of my mostly white classmates. And actually, in college and grad school, I only ever had one single female professor in all of my STEM classes.
Yeah.
But, do I identify as BIPOC? Do I feel disadvantaged because of who I am? Honestly, I would say no. I think that I've lived an extraordinarily privileged life. My father has a PhD. My parents encouraged and really guided me throughout my education. And today when people look at me, they're not at all surprised when I say that I'm a scientist. But an experience about racism that I'll never forget is when a Native American tribal member that I work with told me that he had just been shot at by someone white for exercising his treaty rights. So, in other words, he was shot at just because he was Native, even though he was doing something, fishing in this case, that federal law affirms that tribal members can do. And I have to say that hearing about such overt and violent racism happening today to someone that I know was so shocking. And even though I can't begin to imagine what it feels like, it actually made me realize that the handful of negative experiences that I've faced, it does give me the smallest window into how it can feel to be treated in a certain way based on who I am. And I think that experience of hearing about this partner's his experience, it made me realize that I needed to take a bit of that empathy that I have and leverage it with all the privileges and positions that I enjoy in order to support people who truly are marginalized because of their identity.
Wow, thank you for sharing that powerful story, both and stories of your own life and other experiences that you've had very directly. So thank you. I really appreciate it. I think that's really useful to share these both all of what you just shared there, your dreams and passions and the seeds of inspiration, as well as some of the racism and experiences that you've faced or experienced. So thank you, Crystal.
Okay, so my presentation is on collaboration with Indigenous or tribal communities around groundwater science and wild rice. Now, collaboration is a major theme of my talk, and while it's done in just about any field of science, there are reasons why it's especially important for groundwater science. After all, we're studying underground processes we can't readily see, so we have to collaborate with those using diverse methods to learn about it. And because groundwater is connected to so many processes above ground, we often need to work with earth scientists from other subdisciplines. So who comprises the community of collaborators in groundwater science? Well, I'm at a university and certainly work with other university researchers, and professional societies help bring us together from different institutions. Outside of academia, we work with governmental and non-governmental agencies, local to international. But overall, we're usually looking for other scientists with their expertise certified by academic degrees. But who else holds knowledge about groundwater and its connections to other parts of the environment? Well, I think anyone who has a drinking well must know a fair bit about groundwater, such as this woman in Bangladesh who has to contend with arsenic in her water. And so do farmers who rely on groundwater for irrigation, like this one in sub-Saharan Africa who directly sees the consequences of unpredictable rainfall and recharge. This man from the Hopi tribe in the American Southwest also knows from stories passed down to him that it's not normal that springs around him are now drying up with rising temperatures and groundwater extractions. But here's the thing, if we ignore their knowledge and priorities around groundwater, and we only allow certified experts to make the call on what we understand and how we manage groundwater, then this is when problems of environmental injustice can occur. Many communities face environmental justice issues. Here, I'm focusing on Indigenous communities who have an intimate connection with their land and water, as they have served for generations as environmental stewards. Dakota scholar Waziatowin described the experience of now having their land and water degraded by settler activities. She explains, from the perspective of our worldview, the devastation of our homeland is a mirror reflection of what has happened to our people, because the fate of our people is intertwined with the fate of our homeland. So who am I to be talking about Indigenous land and water justice? Well, I'm not Indigenous. I'm a second-generation Chinese American who has always identified strongly as coming from an immigrant family. But recently, I have come to understand that I am a settler colonialist because my family came to the US to benefit from this place without acknowledging or compensating the Indigenous peoples here. And professionally, I'm a conventionally trained scientist with those academic degrees, and I study integrated groundwater systems using computer models. And 8 years ago, with my expert computer models, I moved to Minnesota. And at the time, there was a heated debate going on about Minnesota's wild rice waters. For those of you unfamiliar with wild rice, it's an aquatic plant that grows naturally in shallow lakes and streams across the upper Great Lakes region. And it's essential that you understand what I've come to learn. And it's that wild rice holds profound cultural importance for Indigenous peoples or Native American tribes here in the region. This includes the Ojibwe, who call wild rice monomen, and the Dakota, who call it psing. Also, tribes' access to wild rice is legally protected by treaties signed by the US federal government. In fact, for the Ojibwe, their migration story revolves around wild rice. They came here to this part of North America from the eastern seaboard centuries ago, following a prophecy to find the food that grows on water. And that food is monomen, or wild rice. And so when I came to Minnesota 8 years ago, there was a controversy around a unique sulfate standard set to protect wild rice waters. Powerful mining companies that release high levels of sulfate were pushing back on this standard, arguing that there was still some uncertainty in how exactly sulfate harms wild rice. And this piqued my interest because I noticed that no one was really looking at the role of groundwater. So I took out my reactive transport models to test the effect of groundwater flow, and I teamed up with a geochemist and geomicrobiologist, and we came up with a sophisticated new conceptual model of the hydrobiogeochemistry and sulfate impacted wetlands. This is all really exciting science. But you know, something was starting to bother me. I was hardly thinking about wild rice or people, even though my original motivation for this work was to help tribes protect their sacred wild rice from industrial pollutants. And I began to realize that I could no longer, with clear conscience, ignore the human side of things. Not only was my home institution of University of Minnesota established using violently appropriated Dakota lands, but I began to learn about the fraught history that University of Minnesota researchers have had with tribes around wild rice. University agronomists have been cultivating wild rice and conducting genetic research on it without the consent of tribes. This is despite tribes repeatedly objecting to this exploitation of their sacred wild rice. And yet here I was, starting my research on wild rice waters, and I have to admit, I did it with absolutely no tribal input. And this made me realize that I needed to take a new approach. So I pulled together an interdisciplinary team from across campus that this time included social scientists. And for an entire half year, all we did was travel to different tribes and tribal organizations across the region. We listened to their concerns about not only wild rice, but also about working with university researchers. I learned that researchers have trespassed on reservations to collect their samples and that geologic maps have been used to displace tribes. I heard that tribal members have been written to grant proposals for outreach purposes without even being asked. So tribes had good reason to be wary of us and in fact to call me out on a number of early missteps that I made. And so finally, after understanding that trust and relationships had to be rebuilt, this is where we are today. This is the full list of our team members. Highlighted in red are Native researchers and Native students, and tribal resource managers and tribal harvesters. And our collaborative was given this Ojibwe name, which means first we must consider wild rice, to remind everyone that we are working to support wild rice and the tribal communities around it. In particular, Native and non-Native students have been the heart and soul of this collaborative, as they have been teaching the rest of us by example what it looks like to work together across different backgrounds. And as we listened to our tribal partners, I realized that my initial narrow focus on sulfate biogeochemistry was really driven by my own research interests. To truly support wild rice in tribal communities, I had to recognize that wild rice is sensitive to multiple environmental stressors. And this is why wild rice has been in widespread decline across the region since Euro-American settlement. But before conducting any research to investigate all these environmental threats, it was essential to develop and sign a protocol with our tribal partners to ensure that our research would be done responsibly and ethically. There's a lot here, but I want to point out that we work closely with tribal partners to come up with our research plans, and we make sure to obtain tribal council approval before carrying out any fieldwork at all. And now we have been doing fieldwork together with our tribal partners. And as we spend more time with tribal partners, some of them have even started to share a bit about how they always think about wild rice in relationship with all the other elements around it. This holistic worldview is in contrast to all the separate disciplines we have in Western science, which honestly has served as a barrier to solving complex problems like climate change. So it's been a tremendous honor and a great sign of trust that some of our tribal partners are asking that we include some of their integrative knowledge into our research. And I can assure you that collaborating with tribes has been completely transforming our science. For example, tribes understand the important link between wild rice and water, and they've been asking us to look at groundwater. And it turns out that at many sites where we're working together where there's abundant rice, we've been observing upwelling of groundwater. And we're exploring how this upwelling could be helping to buffer against surface water contaminants like sulfate, or be providing nutrients or modulating temperatures for wild rice. Now, in groundwater science, we refer to this unique area where surface water and groundwater mix as a hyporheic zone. It astounded me one day when a Lac de Flambeau tribal partner said to me, "We have a word to refer to that part of the stream bed, where water from above meets water from below." Wow, so while the hyporheic zone has only recently become a hot research topic in hydrology, the Ojibwe have long had a word in their everyday vocabulary to talk about it. Okay, so we thought we were catching on to our tribal partners' integrative thinking as we were looking at the hyporheic zone. But then a Fond du Lac tribal partner pointed out that we still weren't getting the full picture. She asked, "Yeah, but what if the forest around the wild rice lake changes, like what can happen with climate change?" This was a really good question. So we conducted computer model experiments to test her hypotheses at a site we'll keep anonymous to protect tribal data sovereignty. Very interestingly, when we ran the model with forest change in addition to climate change, the model predicted considerably higher surface and groundwater runoff in the springtime. And this is concerning because this can lead to both uprooting and impaired growth of wild rice seedlings. And our findings were also scientifically noteworthy because people just don't usually consider the compounded effects of vegetation and climate change on hydrology. Now, I've got to say, I started to worry that maybe we scientists have been the ones benefiting most from this collaboration. But a Lac de Flambeau tribal partner reassured me that she believes that reciprocal support between tribal knowledge and Western science is needed to best steward wild rice. And I think we're starting to see how this can happen. In this modeling example, the model showed a relationship between canopy cover and radiation that was consistent with tribal knowledge about dark places under old growth conifers. So we had tribal knowledge helping to calibrate computer models that can in turn help tribes predict and prepare for future impacts on wild rice. So clearly, a major result from our collaborative thus far is that sharing and co-production of knowledge by tribal communities and university researchers deepens our understanding of the environment, and it ensures that our research benefits communities. And our first journal publication, co-authored by tribal partners and university members, describes the essential relationship building step that makes all of this possible. So as you can see, building a genuine partnership with tribes and working with them around groundwater and wild rice is helping us move off the fraught timeline that the University of Minnesota has been on so that we can do accountable and holistic research that honors tribal sovereignty. So my final question to you is this: what role can you play at your institution so that research there is done in an ethically responsible way with Indigenous and other marginalized communities? With that, thank you, and here is some information about how you can contact us and learn more.
Thank you so much, Crystal. That was wonderful to hear more about your research and how and the evolution of that research through the ever deepening partnership with tribal partners. So thank you for sharing, and I hope there's a lot of value in that for other people in their work and learning around the world. So thanks again.
Thank you so much.